My brother has never once in his life asked anyone for help. This is a fact about Alaric that predates my memory, having been remarked upon by nurses, tutors, and at least one bishop. And so when I tell you that I stood in the doorway of his study at Wincliffe and heard him ask Miss Eleanor Ashworth to marry him, or rather, to pretend to, I want you to understand the full weight of what it cost him to say the words at all. "I am not asking you to marry me," he said, in the flat, clipped voice he uses when he is trying very hard not to sound as though he is asking anyone for anything. "I am asking you to appear to be my intended bride for the duration of the house party, 3 weeks, perhaps 4. After which the engagement will be quietly ended, and you will be compensated for your time at triple your usual rate." Miss Ashworth did not laugh, which surprised me because I very nearly did from the doorway, where I had no business standing at all. She was seated at the smaller desk in his study, where she kept the estate ledgers in a hand so neat it looked printed, and she set down her pen with the particular care of a woman deciding whether to be insulted. "You want me to lie to your entire family," she said, "and several hundred guests for a month." "I want you to protect my sister," Alaric said, and there it was, the one true note in the whole absurd proposal, the thing that made it something other than madness. Wilhelmina is 19, and she believes herself in love with a man who has already run through 2 fortunes belonging to 2 other young ladies before he set his sights on hers. Roland Fenwick does not care for my sister. He cares for the £40,000 our father left her. I cannot forbid his suit. He has done nothing yet that society would call improper, and Wilhelmina would only love him more fiercely for the forbidding. You know how she is. But if he believes the family is already secured, if he believes I am spoken for, and therefore not so pressingly in want of directing every eligible connection I have management over, he loses interest. Men like Fenwick always do, when the ground shifts under them. He will go and find some other heiress to torment. I should explain, since I am the one telling this story. I am Frederick, Alaric's younger brother by 4 years, and I had known about the scheme roughly 9 minutes before Miss Ashworth did, because Alaric does not do anything, even something this reckless, without informing me first. I had told him it was lunacy. I had also told him I would help him carry it off, because lunacy is more interesting than the alternative, which was watching Fenwick slither closer to Wilhelmina for another season, while Alaric brooded about it in silence. Miss Ashworth looked at him for a long moment. She was not a great beauty in the way the London papers meant the word, but she had a directness to her face, a stillness that made you want to keep looking at her to see what she'd do next. She had been keeping the Wincliffe account straight for 8 months, ever since old Prout retired, and in that time she had corrected exactly 4 errors of Alaric's own making, and never once, to my knowledge, addressed him as anything but "Your Grace," in a tone that suggested the title amused her more than it impressed her. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire an actress from London." "An actress would need to be taught the estate, the tenants, the names of 40 relations, and how to hold a fork the way this family holds a fork," Alaric said. "You already know it all. And you are not impressed by me, which means you will not forget yourself and actually fall in love with the role." "That's rather insulting to both of us," Miss Ashworth said. "Though I take your meaning, I am not immune to the title, Your Grace. I simply do not eat it for breakfast." She picked her pen back up, turned it over once in her fingers, set it down again. "What are my terms?" This was the part that made me like her, before she'd even properly met me. She did not simper or demur, did not pretend to be swept off her feet by ducal attention, and did not pretend the money didn't matter either. She named her terms as though negotiating a contract for grain, which in a sense she was. "Triple pay, as I said. A written letter signed by you, attesting to my full competence as a bookkeeper and estate manager, which I may use as reference for future employment. My evenings remain my own after 10 o'clock, and when this ends, it ends cleanly, no lingering rumor that I jilted you, no suggestion that there is anything untoward in my character. I have my reputation to keep after you no longer require my services, Your Grace, and it is the only fortune I possess." "Agreed," Alaric said, before she had even finished the sentence, which told me more than he meant it to. "Then I accept." She held out her hand, not for him to kiss, but to shake, businesslike, the way men do at Tattersall's over the sale of a horse, and Alaric, my brother, who does not touch people he is not related to, took her hand and shook it, and I saw something cross his face that I did not have a name for yet, though I would come to. I stepped fully into the room at that point, because eavesdropping has its limits, and I wanted to be introduced properly to the woman who had just agreed to become my sister-in-law by pretense. "Miss Ashworth," I said, bowing with more flourish than necessary, "I am Frederick the Spare, the Wit, and as of approximately 9 minutes ago, your fellow conspirator. You should know what you've signed on for. Wilhelmina is the dearest creature alive, and utterly without sense where Fenwick is concerned, and my brother is this, all the time. Fenwick himself will arrive within the weak-smelling blood in the water the moment he hears there's a new duchess-to-be, so you'll want to be ready to be disliked by at least one person at very close range. I am accustomed to being disliked by men who think a woman ought not to understand a ledger better than they do," Miss Ashworth said. "I expect I'll manage." I liked her already, standing there in that study with the late afternoon light coming gold through the windows, and my brother still holding a slightly too long grip on a handshake that ought to have ended 10 seconds prior. The house party arrived in the manner of all such parties, a great confused wave of carriages, trunks, ladies' maids, and second sons hoping to be noticed, descending on Wincliffe over one very long Thursday. My brother had scheduled the announcement of his engagement for that first evening, at dinner, where it would do the most good and allow the least time for anyone to ask awkward questions. Miss Ashworth prepared for it with the same brisk competence she brought to the account books. She had, at Alaric's insistence, been given 3 new gowns by the local seamstress, well cut, in deep colors that suited her. She wore a warm burgundy that first night, and when she came down the great staircase at Wincliffe with her chin level and her shoulders back, I do not think a single soul in that hall doubted for one moment that she was exactly what she claimed to be. Except, of course, for Roland Fenwick, who did not believe anything he had not personally verified to be to his advantage. He arrived that same evening, fashionably late, with Wilhelmina's arm already tucked proprietarily against his own, my sister having gone out to greet his carriage herself, which told me everything about how far things had progressed while I was away tending our aunt's estate in Kent. He was a handsome man, with the particular polish of someone who has spent a great deal of borrowed money on his tailoring, and eyes that moved over a room the way a merchant's eyes move over a warehouse, cataloging, assessing, pricing. Those eyes found Miss Ashworth within the first quarter hour, standing beside Alaric near the fire, and I watched something calculating settle behind them. "Your Grace," Fenwick said, bowing over Alaric's hand with exactly the correct depth of deference, "I understand congratulations are in order. This is rather sudden news. I confess I had not heard the Duke of Wincliffe was courting anyone at all. We did not see the need to announce a private matter to every drawing-room in England before it suited us," Alaric said, in the tone he uses on tenants who are behind on rent and men he does not like, which in Fenwick's case happened to be the same tone. Of course, and who is the fortunate lady?" Fenwick's gaze slid to Miss Ashworth, and I saw him take her in, the gown, the poise, the fact that he did not recognize her from any London season, any family he could place. "Have we met, Miss Ashworth?" she said, and extended her hand with the same composed directness she'd shown in the study. "Eleanor Ashworth." "I don't believe we have had the pleasure, Mr. Fenwick, though I understand you are already quite well acquainted with the family." There was the faintest edge in that last sentence, and I saw Fenwick hear it and recalibrate. "Ashworth," he repeated. "I don't place the name among the county families." "I shouldn't think you would," Miss Ashworth said pleasantly. "My father was a merchant, wool mostly, and some shipping interests besides." It was beautifully done, an admission of her lower birth delivered with such perfect, unbothered calm that it left Fenwick with nothing to seize upon. He could not sneer at a woman who had already told him plainly what she was and dared him to make something of it. I watched him try, briefly, to find purchase and fail, and I watched Alaric watch her do it, with an expression I had genuinely never seen on my brother's face before, something between astonishment and pride, as though he had handed her a sword expecting her merely to hold it, and instead she had run the first opponent clean through. "A merchant's daughter," Fenwick said slowly, "engaged to a duke, how very modern." "Love does not consult Debrets before it makes its choices," Alaric said, and put his hand, deliberately, I could see the deliberation in it, the slight stiffness of a man performing an action he has decided upon rather than one arising naturally, at the small of Miss Ashworth's back. "Fortunately for me." Wilhelmina, who had been quiet through all of this, chose that moment to fling her arms around Miss Ashworth's neck, in an excess of feeling that nearly upended the woman's balance entirely. "I am so happy," Wilhelmina said. "Alaric has been so dreadfully alone since father died, and now I shall have a sister. Oh, you must tell me everything. How did he propose? Was it very romantic?" "He was very direct about it," Miss Ashworth said, which was, I noted with private delight, the single truest sentence spoken in that entire hall all evening. But I found I did not mind directness in the end. It has its own kind of romance, don't you think? A man who tells you plainly what he wants, rather than making you guess. I had to turn away and pretend great interest in the fire screen, because I was laughing. Fenwick did not laugh. He watched Miss Ashworth with the flat, assessing look of a man revising his figures, and I understood that he had not yet decided to give up the field. He had merely decided to watch a while longer before deciding whether the ground had truly shifted, and either possibility, I suspected, would only make him more determined to find the crack in it. Dinner that first night was its own small theater. Alaric had seated Miss Ashworth at his right hand, which raised eyebrows among the older relations present. Great-aunt Cordelia fixed the arrangement with the look of a woman doing sums in her head and not liking the total, but it was Fenwick's seat, 3 down and directly across, that made the evening interesting. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," he said, over the fish course in a voice pitched to Carrie, "what does one do exactly before one becomes a duchess? Were you presented at court? I confess I cannot recall your family being mentioned in any of the usual notices." "I kept books," Miss Ashworth said, without hesitation, without apology. "Accounts, ledgers. I have a talent for figures that my father found more useful than fashionable, and so I was put to work rather than put on display, which I have always thought the more sensible arrangement of the two." "Books," Fenwick said. "How industrious." "I expect I shall find plenty to occupy a duchess's hours," Miss Ashworth said, "though I confess I would miss a good ledger. There is a satisfaction in a column that balances, Mr. Fenwick, that I have never found anywhere else. Everything accounted for, nothing hidden, nothing owed that isn't shown plainly on the page." She did not look at him when she said, "nothing hidden," but I saw him hear it anyway, and I saw Wilhelmina, 3 seats down, entirely miss the undercurrent, and I felt a small, cold worry settle in my chest that this business might not end so easily as Alaric hoped. "You have a sharp tongue for a merchant's daughter," Fenwick said, smiling in the way that men smile when they mean to wound and want credit for wit besides. "I have a sharp mind, Mr. Fenwick, which sometimes produces a sharp tongue as a consequence." She turned then to Alaric, and something in her face softened deliberately for the benefit of the table. I could see the deliberateness of it, and yet somehow it did not look false, which unsettled me more than if it had. "Your Grace, you promised to tell me the story of the West Folly and never did. I understand your grandfather built it to win a wager." "He built it to win an argument with my grandmother," Alaric said, "which he then lost anyway, because she declared it an eyesore and made him plant ivy over the whole of it within the month. There has never been a Wincliffe Duke who won an argument with his duchess. It is, I am told, a condition of the title." It was the smallest thing. A piece of family history, delivered dryly, meant only to starve Fenwick of further sport. But I saw Miss Ashworth's mouth curve at it, a real smile, and I saw Alaric watch her smile the way a man watches weather change, uncertain whether to trust the improvement. "I shall want to see the ivy," she said. "I shall show you tomorrow if you like it." It was such a small exchange, and yet I felt the whole table's attention bend toward it in a way it had not bent toward any of Fenwick's louder sallies, because there is nothing so magnetic as 2 people speaking as though the room has emptied out around them. The dancing came 2 nights later, after a full day of house-party business, a shooting party for the gentlemen that Alaric endured rather than enjoyed, and a long walk through the gardens for the ladies that Wilhelmina spent almost entirely at Fenwick's side, much to my growing unease. Fenwick was attentive to her in the particular way of a man laying siege to a fortress, patient, thorough, careful never to overstep in a manner that could be reported to her brother, and utterly certain of his eventual success. But the ball, when it came, belonged to Alaric and Miss Ashworth, because a ball requires dancing, and dancing requires a public performance of exactly the kind their arrangement had been built for. "I don't dance well," Alaric told her in the hallway outside the ballroom, in a voice low enough that I had to lean rather obviously to catch it. "My mother despaired of me." "I suspect the trouble is not dancing at all, but being watched while you do it," Miss Ashworth said. She held out her hand. "Come, I promise not to report your missteps to anyone who matters." He took her hand and led her out, and I abandoned my post near the punch table entirely to watch, because I had never in my life seen my brother dance as though he wanted to be doing it. He is a competent dancer, technically, but competence and willingness are different animals, and I had watched him partner a dozen eligible young ladies over the years with all the enthusiasm of a man crossing a cold river. This was different. He held her at the correct distance, and then in the turn his hand settled at her waist a half-second longer than the step strictly required, and I watched her not pull away from it, watched her instead look up at him with an expression that made my chest do something strange and unfamiliar on my brother's behalf. "You are meant to be scowling less," she told him, quietly enough that I only caught it because I had drifted close under the pretense of fetching a second glass of punch I did not want. Engaged men are permitted to look pleased about it. "I am pleased," Alaric said, and there was something in his voice that made her missing step land wrong for exactly one beat, though she recovered so smoothly I doubt anyone but the two of us, myself hovering, and Fenwick watching from the edge of the floor with his arms crossed, noticed it at all. "That was very nearly convincing," she said. "It was not a performance." Alaric, she said his given name I noticed for the first time, and I saw it land on him the way a hand lands on a shoulder, warm and startling. "We agreed on the terms." "I am keeping to the terms. I am merely observing that I am pleased." There was no clause forbidding pleasure. She laughed, a real laugh, quickly suppressed, but real all the same, and I thought, watching them, that I had perhaps underestimated how thoroughly this scheme of my brother's might unravel, and how little either of them would mind it. Fenwick, for his part, did not dance with Wilhelmina that night, a fact I noted and did not understand until later, when I realized he had spent the better part of the evening instead maneuvering to speak with Miss Ashworth alone, a task made difficult by Alaric's evident reluctance to let her more than a few feet from his side, but not impossible, because a large house party has a great many corners, and Fenwick was patient. He found his opening near midnight, in the alcove by the terrace doors, where Miss Ashworth had stepped out for air, and I had followed at a discreet distance, having appointed myself her unofficial guard for reasons I did not examine too closely at the time. "Miss Ashworth," Fenwick said, appearing at her elbow with the smoothness of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "A word. I find myself curious about the timing of your engagement. Wilhelmina mentioned to me that she had never heard your name before this week, not from her brother, not from anyone in the family. For a duke to keep so significant an attachment entirely secret until the very eve of announcing it strikes me as rather sudden. One might almost think the engagement was arranged for my particular benefit. Or rather, my particular discouragement." Miss Ashworth turned to face him fully, drawing herself up in that stillness that was somehow more formidable than any raised voice could have been. "Mr. Fenwick, I don't know what you imagine my private affairs to have to do with your courtship of Miss Wilhelmina, but I find the implication insulting, both to myself and to his grace. I did not agree to marry a duke in order to inconvenience a fortune hunter." She let the last two words sit there, plain and unadorned, and I saw him flinch very slightly at hearing the thing named aloud. "Perhaps you ought to examine whether you have given anyone cause to wish you unwelcome, rather than assuming the fault lies elsewhere." She left him standing in the alcove and returned to the ballroom, and I fell into step beside her before Fenwick could recover himself enough to follow. "That was rather magnificent," I told her. "He is not a fool," she said, real worry under the composure now that we were out of his hearing. "He suspects something. I don't know how much, but he suspects. Suspicion is not proof, and a man like Fenwick does not abandon a 40,000-pound prospect over a suspicion he cannot voice publicly without looking a fool himself." I said this with more confidence than I entirely felt. "It depends on whether Wilhelmina can be brought to see him clearly before her heart is too deep to listen to her own eyes. And you, I think, she might actually hear, where Alaric forbidding him outright would only make her cling the harder. Why would she listen to me? I am a stranger playing at being her sister. You are the first person who has ever spoken to her honestly about being valued for her figures rather than her fortune. That story will travel faster than any lecture Alaric could give." She laughed at that properly, and we went back in together, And if I felt a small private satisfaction at having said something true that might also nudge two stubborn people a little closer together, I think I may be forgiven for it, given how the story ends. The days that followed took on a rhythm I had not expected. Alaric and Miss Ashworth performed their engagement, walked the gardens together, sat beside each other at meals, exchanged the small tender words a watching house party required. And somewhere in the performance, the lines meant to separate performance from reality began, very quietly, to blur. I noticed it first in small things. Alaric had never, in my memory, sought anyone out simply for the pleasure of their company. But I began to find him in the estate study of an evening long after the day's business was concluded. And when I glanced in, I more often found the ledgers closed, and the two of them simply talking. About the tenants, about her father's business, about 100 small things that had nothing to do with any pretense at all. He asked me about my mother today, Miss Ashworth told me, one afternoon when I found her alone in the rose garden, ostensibly cutting flowers, but in truth, I suspected, taking a moment's rest from the exhausting business of being watched. She died when I was 12. I don't think I've told anyone that in years. He has a way of listening that makes you forget you meant to keep something to yourself. He told you about his father, too, I take it, I said, for I had guessed as much from the change in my brother of late. How the old Duke died suddenly, of a seizure of the heart, with Alaric barely 21 and utterly unprepared for the weight of it landing on him all at once. How he learned that asking for help was a luxury a duke could not afford, because everyone who might help him also wanted something from him. She looked at me startled. He has never told that to anyone, I said, not even me. Then I don't know what to do with the fact that he said it to me, Miss Ashworth said, something almost frightened in her voice now. This was meant to be a business arrangement, Frederick. I keep books. I do not know what to do with a man who looks at me as though I might be trusted with something breakable. What do you feel when he looks at you that way? She did not answer for a long moment, frightened, not of him, of how much I find that I don't mind it. I did not press her further, but I carried the words with me, and that evening, finding Alaric alone in his study with a ledger open before him that he was very plainly not reading, I decided the moment had come to be somewhat less than subtle. You know this ends when the party ends, I said without preamble, dropping into the chair across from his desk. The terms were clear. And you don't want them kept. He set down his pen with more force than the action required. Frederick, I am your brother. I am permitted to say the thing you won't say to yourself. In 2 weeks of pretending to court her, you have told her things about our father you have never told me. A man does not hand his deepest wound to a woman he intends to release from his employ at month's end without so much as a backward glance. It is not so simple as you make it sound. Alaric's jaw was tight. I asked her into a lie for my own convenience and structured the arrangement so that neither of us would ever have to examine whether there was anything real underneath it. If I tell her now that I want the engagement to be true, how is she to know whether I mean it, or whether she has simply confused gratitude for something warmer because I have made it nearly impossible for her to tell the difference? It was a more thoughtful objection than I had expected, true to the shape of my brother's deepest wound. Not pride, not station, but the old terrible uncertainty, planted in him at 21 when our father died and the whole weight of the dukedom landed on him at once, of never quite knowing who wanted him and who wanted merely what he could give them. Then don't ask her while the lie is still standing, I said. End it first once Fenwick is dealt with. Then, with no bargain clouding the question, ask her the real question, as a man with nothing to offer her but himself. Alaric looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face, the brooding, guarded set of it that had been there since our father's death, that I sometimes thought would never fully leave him, eased very slightly for the first time in longer than I could remember. When did you become wise, Frederick? I have always been wise. Deal with Fenwick first. The plan, when it came together over the following days, required Miss Ashworth's particular talents more than my own cleverness. Fenwick's weakness was not merely greed, but vanity. He could not bear to be seen to fail, and it was this vanity Miss Ashworth proposed to use against him. He suspects the engagement is false, she said, laying it out for Alaric and myself in the study one evening. He cannot prove it, and so he has shifted from courting Wilhelmina openly to courting her privately, which suggests he means to press for an understanding, or perhaps an elopement, before anyone can stop him. An elopement, Alaric said, and I watched the color leave his face, watched 8 years of fierce, silent protectiveness rear up all at once. He has not yet said the word, so far as I can determine, but he is building toward it, and I think we ought not wait for him to reach it, Miss Ashworth said, her calm steadying my brother better than any argument could have. I propose we give him what he thinks he wants to see, and let his own greed undo him. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Wilhelmina would be told the plain truth about Fenwick's finances without lecture and allowed to draw her own conclusions. Separately, Fenwick would be given the chance, engineered, but appearing natural, to overhear Miss Ashworth and Alaric discussing a review of Wilhelmina's marriage settlement, one making plain the dowry would be held in strict trust, inaccessible to any husband, released only incrementally over decades. It is not even entirely a fiction, Miss Ashworth pointed out. I have been recommending exactly such a structure for months, on sound financial principle, quite apart from Fenwick. We are merely arranging for the wrong man to overhear the right conversation at the most useful moment. It worked better and worse than any of us anticipated. The overheard conversation took place 2 days later, in the estate's book room, which adjoined the terrace where Fenwick had taken to smoking of an evening. I was stationed close enough to intervene should his temper turn ugly, though I confess my primary purpose was simple curiosity as to how the scene would play. 20,000 held in trust, released at £500 per annum beginning at her 25th birthday, the remainder settled only upon the birth of an heir, and administered thereafter by trustees, Miss Ashworth said, her voice pitched to carry through the half-open door with perfect naturalness. No husband will have direct claim on the principal under any circumstance. Good, Alaric's voice answered. See it drawn up by week's end, so there can be no question later of anyone's intentions toward my sister being anything but honorable. When I risked a glance around the doorframe, I found Fenwick standing quite still, his cigar gone out between his fingers, his face for one unguarded moment stripped of all its careful polish, and showing instead something closer to raw calculation curdling into fury. He left Wincliffe 2 days later, with a suddenly remembered urgent business in London that had not, to anyone's knowledge, existed the week prior. He made his excuses to Wilhelmina with every appearance of regret, promised to write, and I do not believe a single letter ever arrived, because a man like Fenwick does not waste postage on a prospect that has stopped paying. Wilhelmina wept for 2 days, which I had expected, and then on the 3rd day came to find me in the library with red eyes and a determined chin. Elinor told me something rather awful about him, she said. Elinor, I noted, not Miss Ashworth. A shift that told me the 2 women had grown considerably closer than the arrangement strictly required. His tailor's bills alone would beggar a small estate, and 2 other young ladies with fortunes like mine had been courted by him before, both times abandoned the moment their families secured the settlements against his reach. She did not tell me not to love him. She only told me the figures and let me do the arithmetic myself. And what did the arithmetic tell you? That I was a fool, but I would rather be a fool who learns than a fool who marries him. She looked at me with sudden shrewd interest. Is that engagement of Alaric's real Frederick? He looks at her the way I always imagined a man ought to look at the woman he loves. I found I did not have a ready answer, which was in itself an answer of a kind. Ask me again in a fortnight, I said. I suspect the situation will have clarified itself by then. The house party dispersed over the following week in the ordinary gradual manner of such things, carriages departing daily, trunks loaded, farewells exchanged on the front steps with all the usual promises to write that are rarely kept in full. Fenwick's departure had taken the shine off the gathering for some of the younger guests, but for the family, I think, it came as a quiet, tremendous relief, the release of a held breath none of us had quite admitted to holding. And through it all, the question of Alaric and Miss Ashworth's engagement hung suspended, unaddressed, the terms of the original bargain technically fulfilled, and yet neither party making the smallest move to invoke the clause that would end it. I found Miss Ashworth on the last morning of the party, standing in the estate study with her trunk already packed and waiting by the door, looking over the ledgers one final time with an expression I could only call reluctant. You're meant to give notice that the engagement is ended, I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Fenwick is gone. The terms are fulfilled. By every rule you laid down, you are free to walk away this morning with your dignity and your fortune both intact. I know the terms, I wrote them myself. She set down her pen and looked at me with an expression more unguarded than I had yet seen on her. But I don't know how to end it, Frederick, not cleanly. I agreed to a bargain, and somewhere in the keeping of it, I stopped being able to tell where the bargain ended, and my own heart began. You have simply discovered that my brother is rather easy to love once a person gets past the brooding. I could have told you that 8 months ago. And if what he feels is only gratitude and the strange intimacy of performing intimacy for 3 weeks running and not, she stopped, unable to finish. Then you will have lost nothing you did not already stand to lose. But I do not think you are wrong, Eleanor. Go and find my brother before your trunk goes onto that carriage. He has been waiting 3 weeks for the courage to say something that has nothing to do with fortune hunters or house parties, and he will not manage it unless someone makes the first move. He only knows how to arrange elaborate schemes that let him have what he wants without ever admitting he wanted it. Something in her face firmed into the same quiet resolve I had watched her deploy against Fenwick in the alcove. Where is he? The West Folly, I said, where his grandfather lost the argument with his grandmother. Fitting, given how this particular argument is likely to go. I did not follow her. Some scenes, even a narrator devoted to his brother's happiness, has no business witnessing firsthand, and I have had to reconstruct what followed from what each of them later told me, separately in the weeks after, when the full truth of that morning at the Folly had settled enough to be spoken of without either of them going pink about the ears. Alaric was standing at the Folly's edge, looking out over the grounds where the last carriages wound down the long drive, when Eleanor found him. He turned at the sound of her step, and so he told me later. His first thought was that she had come to say goodbye, and his second was that he could not bear it. The terms are fulfilled, she said, echoing my own words back to him without knowing it. Fenwick is gone. I ought to be halfway down that drive myself within the hour. You ought, Alaric agreed, and yet you are here instead. I have a question I cannot leave without asking. I am accustomed to certainty. I balance columns for a living, and I do not care for a sum I cannot solve. Whether what has passed between us these 3 weeks was only ever the performance we agreed to, or whether somewhere in the performing of it, it became something else. Alaric, my brother, who does not ask for things, who has spent the whole of his adult life believing that need makes a man vulnerable, crossed the small distance of the Folly and took her hands in his. It was never only a performance for me, he said. I asked you to pose as my fiancée because I could not bring myself to ask you to simply be my fiancée. I did not believe a woman like you would ever look twice at a man like me if I asked plainly, and it was easier to build an elaborate lie than to risk hearing you refuse. That is a coward's reasoning, and I am ashamed of it, but I would rather be ashamed and honest than proud and alone. I do not want the engagement to end. I want it to become true. I want to marry you, not the woman who agreed to pose as my bride for triple pay, but the woman who corrected my accounts 4 times in 8 months, who faced down Fenwick without raising her voice, who taught my sister to do sums about her own heart. I love you, Eleanor, and I am asking you now with no bargain standing between us and nothing to offer but myself and this ridiculous, ivy-covered folly. Will you marry me? Truly. No pretense. I am told Eleanor did not answer immediately, that the silence stretched long enough for him to brace, in his old guarded way, for refusal. I have one condition, she said finally. Name it. That you never again ask me to pretend anything with you. Not affection, not ease, not happiness. If you are troubled, you tell me. If you are glad, you tell me. I have spent 3 weeks learning to read the difference between your performed contentment and your real contentment, Alaric, and I find I never want to have to make that distinction again. I want the real thing, plainly stated, the way I keep my books, nothing hidden, nothing owed that isn't shown clearly on the page. Agreed, Alaric said, the same word I am told that he had used in his study 3 weeks prior, when she first named her terms for the pretense, except that this time, Eleanor told me later, his voice broke very slightly on it, which was the thing that finally convinced her utterly, more than any speech could have, that the man asking her was not performing anything at all. Then yes, she said, I will marry you. Truly. What happened next, I was not present to witness, save to say that when I found them both some 3/4 of an hour later, still at the Folly, there was a particular unguarded softness about my brother's face that I had not seen there since before our father died. and Aliner's hand was resting in the crook of his arm in a manner that required no performance whatsoever to look entirely natural. "I take it," I said, strolling up with what I hoped was an appropriately casual air, "that the sum balanced favorably." "Frederick," Alaric said, with a warning note that had lost every trace of its old iron and become instead something closer to fond exasperation, "go away." "Absolutely not. I have waited 3 weeks to say I told you so." I turned to Aliner. "Did he tell you it was never a performance?" I heard that speech rehearsed twice in his study, though it improved a great deal in the delivery. "You rehearsed it," Aliner said to Alaric, delight breaking through her composure at last, "and you told me it was spontaneous." "It was spontaneous in every particular that mattered," Alaric said, with as much dignity as a man can muster while visibly caught out. "He has never in his life managed a spontaneous sentiment without 3 weeks of brooding beforehand," I informed her cheerfully. "You will find, as his wife, that this is simply the shape of the man. He feels everything enormously, and says almost none of it aloud until the pressure builds past bearing. I found it amusing because I knew, the moment he asked you to pretend, that he had already lost the argument he thought he was starting," I told Aliner. "He chose the one woman he could not stop thinking about, and invented a reason why thinking about her was purely professional necessity." The betrothal, once genuine, was announced properly this time, with none of the haste that had marked the first performance of it. Alaric wrote to every relation himself, and I noticed, reading over his shoulder, that he no longer wrote as a man discharging an obligation, but as a man who wanted the whole world to know what had happened to him. Word reached the county within days, and I took a certain wicked satisfaction in watching the same drawing rooms that had gossiped about the first engagement now gossip with equal enthusiasm about how right the match seemed. Aliner insisted on one further condition before the wedding. "I should like to keep the ledgers," she told Alaric one evening in the study where the whole scheme had begun. "Not as an economy, though we could well afford another bookkeeper now. I should like to keep them because I am good at it, and because I do not wish to give up the one part of myself that first brought me into this house on my own merit, rather than on your arm." "I would not dream of asking you to give it up," Alaric said. "I expect you will now correct my errors with considerably less formality than your grace." "I shall correct them just as thoroughly, formality or no." "I would expect nothing less. It is the whole reason I fell in love with you, that you have never once let me get away with anything. I do not think I could love a woman who flattered me. I have had a lifetime of people flattering the title, and none of them ever cared to correct the man wearing it." They were married that autumn, at the small church on the Wincliffe estate, with none of the elaborate performance that had marked their false engagement, and all of the quiet certainty that had grown up underneath it. Wilhelmina stood as Aliner's attendant, having spent the intervening months growing, under Aliner's patient tutelage, considerably shrewder about ledgers and considerably wiser about men who admire figures more than character. She would, 2 years later, marry a quiet young baronet with a genuine talent for horse breeding, and no interest whatsoever in her dowry beyond ensuring it was properly invested. Great-Aunt Cordelia, who had done sums in her head at that first dinner and not liked the total, declared herself entirely satisfied with the eventual arithmetic, and took considerable credit for having predicted the whole affair from the start, a claim I have never contradicted, since it costs me nothing and delights her enormously. As for Alaric, my brooding, guarded, magnificent fool of a brother, I have watched him become something I scarcely recognized from the man who once could not bring himself to ask his own family for help carrying a grief he thought he had to bear alone. He asks Aliner for her opinion now, openly, on matters of the estate and matters of the heart both, and takes correction from her with a grace I never managed to teach him myself. He still keeps his own counsel more than most men would think healthy, and I suspect he always will. Some wounds do not close so much as they learn to be tended. But he no longer mistakes the tending for weakness. I think that is the whole of what Aliner Ashworth, merchant's daughter and finest bookkeeper in 3 counties, gave to the Basalt Duke of Wincliffe. Not merely a fortune hunter driven off, not merely a sister rescued, but a husband who finally understood that the strongest ledgers are the ones 2 people keep together. Nothing hidden, nothing owed that is not shown plainly on the page, and every column at long last beautifully, truly balanced. I stood up at the wedding breakfast, as brothers are obliged to do, and made a toast that I had, unlike Alaric's proposal, genuinely not rehearsed, though I doubt anyone believed me afterward, since it came out rather better than my usual efforts. To my brother, I said, raising my glass, who once told me that asking for help was a luxury a duke could not afford, and who has since discovered that the truest help a man can ask for is the sort that mends a man himself, quietly, over the course of a house party neither of us will ever quite explain properly to our grandchildren. To a leaner, who came into this family under false pretenses and stayed under entirely true ones. And to Fenwick, without whom none of us would have discovered any of this at all, but to whom we owe a strange sort of gratitude, for being villainous enough to force two stubborn, wonderful people to stop pretending and start living. The whole hall laughed, and Aliner laughed loudest of all, and Alaric, my brother, the Basalt Duke, hard and unmovable in every way but this one, looked at his new wife with such open, undisguised devotion that I found I had to sit down rather quickly myself, overcome by the joy of watching someone you love most in the world finally, fully, unguardedly happy. I have told this story many times since, and I never tire of it, because it never once stops being the truest story I know.